Thank you for having me.
We're going to be talking today about the path of intellect, which is quite an abstract one out of the 15 that we've been covering over the last few weeks. We've been doing this once a week, a session on one of the life paths of the 15 that can be ways of re-establishing where you want to go in life, whether it's career, whether it's personal development. And the idea of this is kind of like to invite you as a viewer into an inner quest, an inner journey of basically choosing where you want to be in your life based on roles, which we call archetypes. The intention behind this is to use the picture that you see in the background as like a coloring mandala, where you can color in one color the things that were the archetypes that were in your past, in one color the ones that you have now, and in another color the ones that you would like to attract in the future. And you can actually download these. I'll ping a QR code so you can actually see them and download this version for yourself here. But before we go into one of the first ones, I have those three today on the path of intellect. Jonas, this is a really abstract one. How do we start thinking about the path of it? How do we intellectualize the path of intellect? Where do we start on this? If we start,
I think, to avoid some big misconceptions around this topic, we tend to often oppose intellectual with manual. Right, in school, very typically, you're either sent towards something where you're having more to think, reflect, and analyze, or something where you're having to do. But it's actually quite a stupid distinction in many respects, because I think this, having worked on construction sites as well. We've worked on some together, actually. It's absurd to think that you're not having to think and reflect when you're building a filtration system for a pool, for example, or a house or anything. So with this path, the first thing to avoid is to think, oh, well, there are people that are intellectual and people that are not intellectual. Path of intellect is just, how are you learning? What is your relationship to, be it a craft or a specific set of ideas, whatever it is that you're learning? How are you learning, and how far are you going in that learning logic? Are you just learning and using? Are you learning and teaching forward? Are you really pushing an expertise in whatever field you're in? So this is not restricted to people who have intellectual jobs or academic careers. This can relate to your local baker, your mechanic, the person cleaning your building, or your accountant. Like, this relates
exactly.
to each one of us.
And I think what you also saying just before we went live, Jonas, was that on the student, the role of student, which if I zoom in now onto this one here, so we can actually have a better look at this, zooming in onto, there we go. So we're on the path of intellect, which is up here, and we're now going to be zooming upwards towards the first one, which is the student and the abstraction. As you pointed out, you have abstraction in any form of learning, including manual work. And you had a couple of comments which I thought were really spot on around the archetype of student who focuses on abstraction, with some of these psychological effects that you were describing. Would you like to open up maybe the Dunning-Kruger effect that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's one of the common ones that we're all exposed to in some way. So basically, the way this was studied is they were asked to give specific opinions. Let's imagine, Estève, I'm asking you about opinion of, like, wars at the moment, every conflict that's going on right now. What is your expert opinion, Estève, on that? And then I would ask you how confident you are in your expertise. Like, let's make it even more concrete. Let's imagine I'm asking you to predict how things are going to evolve in the Middle East. And then I would ask you, how confident out of 10 would you think that is? And they did a study where they did this with experts and people that just knew a little bit about the topic. And what they found was quite interesting. The more you know about a topic, the less confident you are, the more humble and modest you are in your opinions, and the less you feel that you know. And if you're just ignorant enough, that's when you have the most confidence in your predictions and in your understanding of a situation. So it's quite interesting to see, and I think in a concrete way we can probably all relate to that one person that has been doing 2 semesters of psychology in university and now is entitled to explain everything to you about yourself and why you behave the way you behave and why you're totally wrong and why you should be doing this instead. Because they've been studying just enough to touch like the tip of the iceberg and feel like, oh wow, this is all so clear and it makes sense and we can use this, but they're still lacking that nuance and that complexity. So that's a challenge we all face personally, um, in the sense that we might feel a lot more confident than we should be in a lot of our opinions, because chances
Mm.
are we're just ignorant enough in a lot of things. And nowadays, entertainment and education system, like the media, encourages us to have a very shallow understanding of many things without ever really going into the depths of anything. So I
Mm.
would argue
Mm.
we're in an environment that is absolutely beautifully almost designed to make us ignorant and overconfident. And if I was a little bit paranoid, I would think that that would be a great way to divide people in order to rule over them better. But thank God I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I'm not gonna read into that too much. But it's interesting to notice that yeah, this effect you can really see in formal education, and you can see it in your family conversations around politics. Like it's an interesting bias to be
Mm.
aware of.
And so coming back to the whole, the first out of the three on this path, the path of intellect, in terms of student, the key focus, because each one of these three builds off each other. The first one is the internal focus, second is external focus, and the third one is the mastery of the first two, in a sense, in combination. So in the student posture, the key focus is learning about abstraction. And I think with what you said, there's the idea of complexity, being able to have an abstract understanding of the complexity of whatever field, whether it's, you know, building swimming pools, politics, or psychology. There's always some degree of abstraction and complexity that needs to be understood. So in that one, the idea of this exercise that we're doing here is to just help people to understand which ones they've embodied. So if you've been watching these videos and that you're coloring in, you can basically most likely color this in if you've been into university, if you've been into high school, if you've studied anything. Actually, a lot of people. But also, I think it's not just about study. It's not just about school. You can be a student of life. You can continuously learn. You can also study things that are the practical arts, as Jonas was mentioning before. So what would be the key reflection question, since we've been doing this over the sessions, Jonas? Like, what's the reflection question that you would invite to the table if you're in the archetype of student, or if you want to embody more of that archetype in the future?
I think the first level would be to break down your learning material and question why are you learning this. Just like if if I were talking to a student who's trying to pick a university track, for example, we would have to go into like, well, why are you trying to learn this? Is it just because a diploma would look good on your shelf and make mummy proud, or like, are you trying to do anything concrete with it afterwards? Does it make sense to do it? So the first thing would be to question one's motivation. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I want to learn anything?
Mm.
Because you'll learn best if you're having fun and you enjoy what you do. So tapping into a deep intrinsic motivation and learning stuff related to that motivation will probably set you up for less frustration and just more enjoyment overall. And you'll be in a better state to actually learn. So the first one would be, yeah, questioning your motivations. Why? And the second one would be to question, how have I been learning, or how can I learn this just in practice? How do I break down the knowledge? How do I structure it? How do I tangibly go from this big theory and translate that to 5 minute exercises that I can do every day, or big types of practices? Like in general, how can I work on this? How can I learn? How can I put into place this back and forth between theory and practice in order to really make sure that I'm learning as fast as possible? Um, and yeah, that's if we let's make this a little bit more tangible and let's look at cooking, for example, right? I think a lot of
Mm.
us, we didn't learn cooking in cooking school, but most people at least know how to make themselves like a fried egg or something. So how did you actually learn that, and why are you learning this? Well, I'd actually like to learn more about cooking because I realized that it could help me with my budget. If I have less takeaway, it'll be definitely nicer on my bank account at the end of the month. It could be health. I realized that it's very hard for me to get the nutrition that I require if I just buy food that's ready made, or if I go out to restaurants, or just if I look at the lunch options I have around my office or something. It could be I just love food. Like for me, cooking is a meditation. It's a pleasurable activity. So I just want to make sure that I do enough of it as a hobby. Um, so once you've got that motivation, then you can think about, how did I learn to cook that egg? Oh, well, I was watching. It used to be my mum frying eggs in the morning, and when I was a kid, I was allowed to sometimes help her, and that's how I started learning. So I learned by doing and observing other people that were doing it. It could be that you learned because you bought yourself a recipe book when you were in college,
Mm.
and you thought, okay, well, I'm going to start doing my own food because I'm fed up eating grandmother's like traditional cooking or whatever it is. So you can break it down in that way, and then you can go and seek out specific ways to learn. So for some people, the logical step forward might be to buy themselves another recipe book because that's the blocking factor. For another person, the blocking factor might be, I need to go and do my grocery shopping somewhere else because I'm limited by the ingredients that I have when I just go to my local supermarket. I should try and go to a farmer's market once a week. Then I can play Master Chef a lot more convincingly in my kitchen.
Hmm.
Or it could be that you actually just need to go and get yourself a cooking course because you're being limited by technique and theoretical understanding of cooking. It's like I never know which sauces to use when I'm having to freestyle because I don't understand the principles of flavor. So there, getting yourself a little cooking course where you get to learn about the balance between savory, acidic, sweet, umami, and all of these different flavors like that. Then you'll have the theoretical key so that when you're at home, I'm going to use the same amount of soy sauce, rice vinegar, and sweet sake, because there I know that the balance of flavors matches what I learnt in cooking school. So that's
And they are,
how I would encourage going to make that abstract understanding, but tangible and translated into practice. To me, that's the most important thing. You have to have back and forth between theory and practice.
yeah, and that's basically why these two paths are side by side. Is that the path of technique, which is about the skills, beside the path of intellect, which is about the abstraction and the theory versus practice that go really hand in hand. Absolutely. And so then if we move to the next one, or did we want to talk about anything else on this one? I think the student is quite an obvious one for many people when they think of study, but student can be the student of anything. I think that's quite clear. Study in any form of abstract knowledge, from philosophy all the way to accounting. But expert, what is really this archetype about expert? Being an expert, is that an archetype, or is this, how do we unpack this one tangibly?
In practice, once you've been a student for long enough, typically you develop a form of expertise. I think if you look at definitions, you'd have to, yeah, challenge me on that potentially. But I think often expertise is defined as when you've had enough hours of work put into a specific field, you start to develop more of an intuitive understanding. Like experts don't necessarily know how they know what they know, but they know it. They get a sense of things. Um, just because they've been exposed to that specific environment, idea, process, whatever it is, for long enough that, yeah, they kind of become more able to predict things and anticipate and feel them intuitively. So, expertise, chances are, if you've been doing anything for long enough, you are somewhat of an expert. But then the challenge is using that expertise and communicating to other people and applying it, because it's all good being an expert. Um, but often to apply that expertise, then you need to communicate and connect and relate to other people, right? Um, so the biggest challenge around that starts to shift a little bit away from this internal focus of learning, developing critical thinking skills or developing a work method, to now having to develop an interaction and a way to use that and put it out into the world. And to some degree, you have to explain and break it down for people who aren't experts.
Mm,
And that is often the challenge I think you face, because then it goes back to this whole idea of tangibility, and to relate this back to the green, blue, red, to the blue level of making sure
mm.
that what belongs to you is being communicated in a way that is authentic, consistent, and just understandable to other people. How many experts can we think of that just go off on one and you just can't follow them? You don't understand because they're using jargon. They don't realize that for you, you're not used to that mental gymnastics in the same way as they are, and you don't necessarily understand certain key words or fundamental definitions of the words they use. So you're just like, okay, is this person just trying to sound smart? Or are they trying to prove something to me or whatever it is? So there can be some fundamental misunderstandings when you're faced with experts. So yeah,
Good
that would be my
example
two
of that
cents.
would be Hans Rosling, who passed away not too long ago. I think he was Swedish data scientist who was really in some way controversial because he was really an expert on data, big data around the world's affairs, and he was famous for going on TV and debunking sort of journalistic myths about the world, and he would come in with really pragmatic views of things, and generally he was quite optimistic. He would call himself a pragmatic optimist. He says, like, when you look at data, the world is a really great place and we're doing better than we've ever done before, but you know, the sensationalization of media tends to show us a dark and dystopian view of the world. And so he, as an expert, would be able to carry his thought through, but by making very tangible points. And one of my favorite videos from Hans Rosling was when he basically shows the evolution of humanity over the last few hundred years in terms of wealth, but with a chart that just moves. And he just talks about it with everyday language, which is like literally a 12-year-old would understand. But he's still an expert, and he's able to express his thinking very clearly and tangibly. And therefore, I think what you were hinting as well is crossing the tangibility barrier, which comes from the blue video that we have on the Green Elephant channel, where we're talking about how to actually get your point across. You know, first thing is to be conscious of it. Then you have to allow yourself past the permission barrier. Then you have to be heard, and then you have to be able to be using the right level of language that people understand. And finally, there's the tangibility barrier, which is about, are you making sense? Are your words making sense? And once you've crossed those 5 barriers, you really have the ground for having communicated with somebody. And experts, as often as they are expert, doesn't mean that they're able to carry their message across those different barriers. They're often stuck behind one of those barriers. And so if you're intending to be embodying the archetype of the expert, I think that the obvious invitation to reflect on is, how are you able to make your thinking clear to others, not just to yourself? So whether it's writing, drawing, infographics, storytelling, what is the way that you bring your thought to something more than yourself? And many experts end up basically talking to other experts in academic publications, specialist reports, and so on. So that's the second archetype. Maybe the third archetype we could open up, Jonas, like the teacher, which is in a way, the crowning of the first two. A teacher has to have both the constant learning and the expertise enough to be able to teach forward. Do you have where are you teaching? Are you teaching at the moment? Where are you embodying the archetype of the teacher at all?
Yeah, I think in my job as a therapist, there is an element of teaching involved, in the sense that you often need to teach people some of the basic principles or mechanisms that underpin their experience. So let's imagine that someone comes to see you with depression. It's probably useful for them to understand what is typically the experience of depression. Like, what are the thought patterns, if you look at it from the cognitive side? What are the behaviors that increase or tend to decrease depressive symptoms? What do we understand about depression, just to make sense of it? Because making sense of our experience is already to some degree controlling it. And that often feels good, to feel that, like, oh, okay, I at least have some degree of control over what's happening to me. So in that sense, I often have to teach some basic ideas, basic principles. So let me give you an example to go back to the case of depression. One idea that is often useful to have is that avoidance, we know, reinforces depression. How? Because it cuts us off from goal-oriented behavior, which means that we stop having opportunities to get rewards. Like, we don't typically plan something, imagine that it could be good, try, get a reward, and then walk away feeling better about ourselves or just having moved forward in some way. Depression tends to make us lose the ability to anticipate something as being good and decreases the probability that we plan something and then do it. And then
Mm.
typically over enough time, it just ends up isolating us, and people often feel like they have a worse self-esteem than before, and intensely negative view of the world because they haven't gone out into the world to actually check it. So the way that often you would teach that is with a concrete example. You relate it back to their experience, and you start from the very concrete. You see this moment there. You were thinking about taking a shower, and then you were thinking to yourself, "Nah, it's not going to make a difference. Life is shit anyway. What difference does a shower make? We're all going to die alone in the dark anyways. No point in taking a shower." And in practice, when they do take a shower, they'll tell you, "Oh, you know what? Even though I thought that showers are absolutely meaningless and that life is horrendously like shit, I still actually enjoyed that shower. I didn't feel that I was going to, but in practice, I did." So then you relate
Mm.
that back to their experience, and you're like, "See, that's a very common principle. You're not the only one that feels that." And actively avoiding avoidance, choosing to confront things, even small, unspectacular things, can help you tip the scale and go back to a place where you feel some degree of control and you are able to see the world as not being purely bad and everything just being shit. So being a good teacher, I think, not saying that I'm a good teacher, but at least that's what I try to do based on the good teachers that I've had, is to always make this personal. Always make this, well, to relate this back to green, blue, red, always make it green. Speak to the people in their language,
Mm.
with their examples, connecting to their senses, um, so that it feels personally relevant. If it feels personally relevant and you're tapping into the right motivation, people want to learn. It's easy to teach them. And the minute you go off track, then you face resistance, and you have this school type experience where you've got a group of people that don't want to learn, and a person that feels frustrated having to teach them, and everyone hates being there, and everyone is looking at the clock, counting the minutes for the time where they can go to recess or go home. So, yeah, I guess motivation, tangibility, and then making people autonomous. I think in an ideal world, it's this idea of teaching someone to fish
Mm.
instead of giving them fish. That's also the case in my work. My end goal is to make sure people don't need me, that I've empowered them, like through giving them space, understanding, helping them to reconnect to themselves in a different way. And then I actively want my patients to one day tell me, "Thank you, but I don't need to come anymore." That's the best case situation for me,
Mm.
which is a bit weird as a business model if you think about it, but
But if you go back to the teacher, in a sense, like in some cultures, the idea of a teacher is badly seen. In some others, it's highly celebrated. But for example, in the Nordics, often people don't want to be seen as a teacher or teaching. It's kind of associated with being a preacher or taking a higher moral ground or knowing better than others. But the archetype of teacher is way more profound than just passing on knowledge. It's as you said, it's empowering. It's also about reflecting, helping others to reflect and take a step back and distance themselves from their experience. And in that way, many jobs have a room for teaching forward, whether it's designers, whether it is therapists. A teacher doesn't have to be the archetypal school teacher. Any job can have a teaching element. And often I notice that people who do mentoring, who do coaching, or who take, for example, roles in business where they support a team as a leader, who are servant leaders, are often actually also teaching their team autonomy, just like you do with what you explained with therapy. So the archetype teacher has to be understood in this particular diagram as much wider than somebody passes on academic knowledge in an academic context as such. Anybody who's working on reflection.
yeah, you raised a very important point, I think, about basically consent and polarity in teaching as well. That experience you describe in the Nordics of people seeing teaching as preaching or as forcing some kind of control. It's true that there's some cultures where people tend to be more conflict avoidant and indirect, so they're not going to actively say to someone, "Why are you telling me this? I'm not welcoming this information," or they wouldn't
Mm.
challenge or question the dynamic. But it is a good practice, no matter what the culture is, to make sure that if you're stepping into that teacher role, you are having some explicit form of consent, and also you're knowing what the person wants to learn. Because someone, let's bring this back to the example of therapy, someone walking into my practice isn't looking for a university course in psychopathology. They only want to learn about what's relevant to them and what is actually going to help them. Most of the rest they'll find maybe interesting or maybe not even, but it's not relevant. So you always have to constantly check what is relevant to your student, and do they want you to teach anything? Because maybe they're not looking for a mentor or a teacher. Maybe they're actually just thinking out loud or wanting some form of reassurance, but not the whole depth and complexity. So to this notion of feedback as well. Remember when we designed that 3x5 feedback video, like
Yeah.
the good practices around giving and receiving feedback?
Hmm.
That applies to this as well.
So, in a sense, if we take these archetypes as building blocks for future experience, each one of these can be combined with other archetypes, and so the teacher can really nicely be combined with any of the other archetypes. Like if we take, for example, the artisan that's already visible on the screen here, you can take the artisan, which is kind of an expert level role, and be a teacher. I remember in building school, I had a teacher who was an artisan. He was literally very hands on. He would walk around, watch you work, and then he would offer you to show with his tool how he would do the same thing differently, and social learning. And but you can also take that into any of the archetypes, like the carer, the healer, the tantra path, and so on and so on, the manager. So each of these archetypes can be, in a way, a teaching role, particularly when you get to a point in your career when you've actually moved further enough to actually have something to pass down, or if you're deeply called to have that passing on experience where you're pedagogically really interested in passing on knowledge, passing on experience. So that the path of intellect has, at the end of the path, I'll zoom out again so you can see this better. I had this picture here. It's like the study of scriptures is the way to move fast down that path, because each of the path has what we call this sacred practice, which in a sense is nothing spiritual. It's more just like, if you want to holistically approach that and speed down that path. Now, study of scriptures, I'm not talking about scriptures in a religious sense only. I'm talking about anything that is abstract. And generally, one of the most abstract things is philosophical or religious texts. So studying something as abstract as you can find, such as philosophy or religion, but also maths, science, or anything pretty much that is abstract, is going to give you the opportunity to move down that path. What's your most abstract path of intellect study at the moment, Jonas?
Yeah, that will have to be the obscure philosophy podcast that I listen to while I'm doing my laundry and my ironing, stuff like that. Yeah, that's definitely one of the most out there things. But hearing you talk, I was just reflecting on that point, and what came to mind was the idea that there's always this notion of pattern. Like it involves taking a step to the side, so you're
Mm-hmm.
not actually just reading and believing it's not a fact. You have that posture of constant doubt that, like, okay, this is a possibility, but I'm not taking this at face value. So there's an element of critical thinking, I think, that is necessary to be reading at that level, because otherwise you can read
Mm-hmm.
anything, but if you're just taking it as the gospel, it's not serving that philosophical purpose. Um, and then there's always this notion of principles and patterns, and so we know that one of the biases of the human mind is to find patterns in everything. That's why we see shapes in the clouds, even though in practice it's water. Um, but yeah, there's always this notion, if you study something and you're taking that step to the side and you're looking at it from a meta level, thinking about thinking, then some kind of universal principles seem to emerge and some universal patterns. That's something that is quite satisfying intellectually, to see this kind of perfection underneath all things that emerges, whether you're looking at quantum physics or religious principles or just gardening. There's always something about, it's very complex. I don't understand everything. There are certain patterns. Certain things seem to be more likely than others. And
Mm.
yeah, you always find this notion of movement. You see mathematical principles operating, patterns emerging. So yeah, I think that's how I understand the study of scriptures. It's that studying it with that specific meta perspective, which isn't pleasant to everyone. Let's be honest. Like you and I, Esteve, I think we quite enjoy that kind of intellectual gymnastics, but to some people, yeah, that's not necessarily rewarding or fun, and that's also okay. Like we don't have to reach the path of like the level of mastery on all 15 archetypes. Um, yeah, but I
It's
think
just one of
if
those
you yeah.
paths that we can explore, and I think, as you said, it's a matter of choice. I think that's the most important with this archetype wheel, is that the idea that's presented here is that these archetypes are not something that we have to do. They're things that we choose, and even I would invite to sort of get creative with combining archetypes so that you can find new ideas of career paths or personal growth or hobbies even. Um, but I also just wanted to come back, Jonas, to the Pygmalion effect you talked about just before we went live. You were mentioning that, and I was curious how you would connect the Pygmalion effect, if I put the picture up on the screen,
Yeah.
with all of this what we've been talking about.
Okay, so to make this tangible again, imagine a experiment where we have two very similar classes. Normal school, let's make them high school classes, and let's even make it the same class, right? And we just give them two different teachers.
Hmm.
And to one of the teachers, we tell this class is amazing. You're gonna love them. They're motivated. They're curious. They're mature. It's amazing. They don't embody the millennial stereotype in any way. It's none of them ever take out their mobiles in class. Like you'll see, it's really oh my god. You don't even have to be paid to teach them. Like teaching them is its own reward. And to the other teacher, you tell the opposite. You tell them, oh my god, I don't know what they had for breakfast. I'm suspecting it's a mix of cocaine and caffeine. They're just absolute demons, constantly fighting. Two of them, like last week, we had two pregnancies and a murder. So, I mean, good luck out there. Maybe take a bulletproof vest. And if we look at the performance of these two classes over time, and we do it in a standardized way so that we're just objectively measuring their performance as independently as possible from the teacher's performance, what you'll see is that the class who was told was good performs better over time and has typically better self-esteem, and it's overall like a better learning environment, and better learning happens. And to the class, the demon class, well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? They behave exactly as they're expected to behave. And it's interesting to consider both from the teacher's perspective or from the student's perspective. What was the narrative around the class that you were in, do you think? Like in your different classes that you were in school, depending on the public or private school that you were in, like how did
Mm.
this bias affect you? Chances are, if you're from the lower end of the income spectrum, um, you probably had that play against you. And that kind of goes against this idea that we live in a perfect meritocratic society where no matter what school you're from, if you just work hard enough, you'll make it to the top. You could be president if you just work hard enough in school. Yeah, well, chances are that's a little bit more true for some people than for others. And the same as a teacher. Just be aware of the narrative you have related to your students. Like if you go in, I have a concrete, tangible example of this. So I have a patient that works in the oil and gas industry,
Hmm.
and at quite a high level position, and she basically took over from this other person and had a low performing team and had been told they're just lazy, they don't work hard, they're just not like us, so I mean manage your expectations, right? Except my patient happens to be from a non-European place as well, and was very much seeing through this essentially racist narrative and colonial mindset. And she was able to just really approach her team and empower them. Like she wants them to train and to move up, and she actively goes out of her way to get them educational opportunities,
Hmm.
especially to the local workers and the people on the team that are from that place and not just from the company, from the company's country of origin. And so 6 months down the line, she's outperforming all her competitors or comparators, and getting praise from HQ, and her team is the happiest it's been. And all she did was shift basically management style, going for a more soft approach and just speaking to the humanity of the people and empowering them, understanding like you want to go home, you want to pay bills, ideally you want to move up, you want to get a degree. Let's make that happen in exchange for this work. Like we need to actually have a balanced reciprocal relationship. I'm not exploiting you and trying to get as much as possible out of you. I'm willing to give as well. I'm not just here to take. And she proved that in practice, not just in her words. And beautiful shift in performance. So you can even reverse engineer this if you really challenge certain narratives and certain ideas. So yeah, I just thought it's an interesting bias to relate to this specific path because again, chances are we've all been on one end of that spectrum through our expectations, all the expectations that were placed on us.
And actually, as you mentioned this, it reminded me of a book I read recently by Rutger Bregman, sort of a historical journalist who's been writing about. I think the book that made most impact on me was the Humankind, and he makes a case for how the deep humanity the nature of humanity is fundamentally much better than we tend to give it credit for. So in other words, humans are actually really not so violent and destructive as we think from the media. And it's kind of linked to this Pygmalion effect that, like, he calls it the nocebo, the opposite of placebo. It's like, if we think that humans are bad, then we will act accordingly, including on a political level. And then it will become a self-fulfilling negative prophecy, which he calls the nocebo. And therefore, he invites us to think carefully that when we're teaching forwards, his point, one of the points he was making was that teachers are very much responsible for teaching forwards these negative views and passing them down and then reinforcing them over time. So I think if you're interested in the archetype of teacher, one of the interesting reflection points as well is, are you grounded in evidence and fact, or are you grounded in collective mental models and beliefs which are actually just reinforcing past beliefs that are wrong? And where are you positioning yourself on that? There's there's a big ethical question underneath all of that at the moment with how we teach AI, how we actually teach forward what we know from one generation to the next. So it's the teacher role is a really interesting one as an archetype that goes well beyond the school, that goes into the whole, how do we move our society, nudge our society forward by different teacher roles in society, in business and in academia. So there's...
I'm wondering, sorry to interrupt us there, just to bring a
Go.
final layer of tangibility to this, because this also relates to the path of parenting. If I think about you, and I look at how you've tackled that beautiful challenge that is parenting with your two kids, it seems to me that you've done a good job at teaching them how to learn and not teaching them to depend on you. So I'm wondering, like, do you have any concrete concrete things that you're proud of, or concrete examples of what you've done that made your kids into beautifully self-sufficient, curious individuals who are now embarking in their university careers, or like paths as students? Like, what do you think you've done that helped shape them in that specific way? Like, what was the teaching practices? What were the teaching practices that you kind of put into place with them?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was literally just looking at LinkedIn before, and I noticed a post from Elena, my daughter, and her post was related to this. I just pause a second. When they were kids, I used to do a lot of cooking with them, and what we used to do was not cook, but we would just play with curiosity. We would look at the spice rack. We would smell them together. If we cooked something from India, we'd put some Indian music on. We'd smell the spices together and discuss, like, does this one work with this? How does this smell? And I would invite them always to just be curious and to just, what if? How might this be? And that curiosity is very natural in a child, but it tends to sort of go down in school when we tell them all the ready-made truths, and that when, as parents, we get very tired of all the questions. Generally, it gets a bit overwhelming with all the questions. But if at that point we'd see that as an opportunity to cultivate curiosity, and keeping them hungry for more like knowledge and finding out, or I don't know, therefore let's find out together. And I saw Elena just posted, she's just been to a design thinking workshop in Indonesia and in university, and her takeaway from the panel discussion they had there was that the importance of curiosity. So I felt like there's something interesting around, it doesn't matter what you know, but if you've got the curiosity to find out and learn more, then you've learned one of the fundamental life skills of learning to learn, because you already have that motivational drive towards learning something else, rather than just thinking, like in the Dunning-Kruger effect that you mentioned earlier, that we think we know more than we do. So I think that seeding curiosity, I did it through cooking. Some parents do it through sports. There's so many different ways of doing it.
That's a beautiful insight. And if we could probably even turn that into a question, I think, on that would probably be beneficial for our whole species, is how might we also cultivate curiosity for the things we're afraid of, the people we disagree with, and people we perceive as our enemies. Because I think it's easier to cultivate curiosity for the things that we love and that we enjoy and that we know, that are familiar. But how might we develop that curiosity beyond that? Because I think that's what we really need right now to go against some of this mass disinformation, propaganda, and just violence that is all based on dehumanizing other people and stopping our curiosity. Especially in extreme situations like that, there is no more curiosity for what other people think, feel, or for them in general. It's just a faceless mass that needs to be destroyed. So that's my little meta reflection question, as a closing point on my end.
Nicely added. Yeah, because as a teacher, I think that's, in a way, reflecting on. I think that's a beautiful self-reflection question for anybody who wants to be in the archetype of teacher, is how do you cultivate your own curiosity, and how do you help others to cultivate their curiosity? It's a really nice way to sort of sum this path up. And thank you, Jonas. Are there any closing words about this path that we've missed? Anything that you wanted to add, or should we just say goodbye and meet next week for the next path?
No, I think that's pretty much everything I had to say that I can think of. And I think, yeah, it's a nice. I like that note of curiosity as a finishing touch. I think that's a nice, at the same time, concrete but poetic way to look at it.
So if anybody wants to download this and color it in and do their own reflection on this, that's the QR code there to download it. And meanwhile, I'll see you next week, Jonas. Thank you very much.
See you next week. Thank you.